Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf tet of Bava Metzia. And yesterday we learned that Rav Yosef was told by Rav Yehuda that Shmuel said that when it comes to one riding or leading an animal, one of the actions acquires the animal and the other does not. We went through back and forth. We said it had to be some kind of one person doing each of them because clearly, if we were talking about one action, that if in fact on its own one action would acquire and one would not, clearly the leading an animal would acquire and the riding would not. Because everybody agrees that leading an animal acquires. But again, unfortunately, Rav Yehuda did not remember which action made the acquisition and which did not. So after some analysis, we concluded that Rav Yehuda must have been talking about where one person was riding an animal and another was leading it. And in particular, Rav Yehuda would say that leading would make an acquisition while riding would not. Okay, in order to explain our Mishnah, Rav Yehuda would say that the two people riding an animal were both also leading it with their feet. But riding an animal alone, however, might not create any acquisition. So now the Gemara is going to try and see which way we go with respect to riding alone. Do we say riding alone does make an acquisition or does not make an acquisition? So let's take a look. We're at the second to last line of Daf Chet Amabet. Second abbreviation on the line, Tashma, right? So let's listen to a brisa, and the brisa will hopefully show us the way. Unfortunately, it actually will find that it's not necessarily a definitive proof, and I think we'll have two more efforts, and the final one will be definitive. So Tashma, Shnaim Shahayu Moshkin Begamal. You got two people pulling a camel, Umanhigim Bechamor, and two people leading a donkey. Or you got one person pulling and one person leading. So in that situation, so B'mida Zot, as we turn to Tet Amun Aleph, Kanu. So then the Tanakama says that they've made an acquisition. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says no. Lo'olam lo kana achetei meshicha begamal v'hanhaga b'chamor. When it comes to a camel, the way you acquire it is through pulling it. Whereas when it comes to a donkey, you just have to lead it. Okay, so this suggests, but what's the key element here? What did we not discuss in this brisa? We didn't discuss riding. So Katani Mi is Oshaya Echad Moshech Echad Maning. The point is that we said one pulling, one leading. Moshech Umanig in of Al Rachov Lo. When it comes to the pulling and the leading, yeah, that's what works, but it does not work to ride. That's the implication. So no, that is not necessarily the implication. Rather, we can say Huadin Dafilu Rachov. Really, you can say that even riding acquires. And that which we said and we talked about, one pulling and one leading, La Pukim de Rabbi Yehuda. The point of the Tanakama, by talking about the fact that it's only these two, or that it is specifically these two, is to differentiate the position of the Tanakama from Rabbi Yehuda. Because he says you need to do only pulling works for a camel and only leading works for a donkey. And what the Tanakama is telling us is that even the opposite, meaning pulling a donkey and leading a camel, will also affect an actual acquisition. And second, why not combine them and teach them? Meaning, if two people are pulling or leading, and it's a camel or a donkey, so then they acquire it. So why not be briefer? Why expand? So the answer is that actually the Tanakama would not allow one of two things. maybe he wouldn't allow pulling a donkey, and maybe he wouldn't allow leading a camel. We're not sure which, but the point is one of those sides would not be permitted, would not make an acquisition.
How is he
So
leading it without pulling it?
well, it's sort of like yes, I'm sure you've seen somebody running with their dog. Now, sometimes they'll hold the leash of the dog so that the dog can't run away, but usually that leash is not taut. It's loose because the dog is following the leader, following the its owner. That's what we're talking about when we say leading, right? So the point is that if the animal knows who I am as its owner, or even it has recognized that when somebody leads it in a particular direction, it's supposed to go. There doesn't have to be anything that ties between the animal and the person who's leading it. It could just be to follow it. And indeed, we'll be talking about why somebody might ride instead of leading during the course of today. There's a Rashi that directly addresses your point and highlights that. But that's what we're talking about. Again, you can imagine, somebody, maybe they'll have a reed to sort of get the cow moving, but the cow knows that it's supposed to, follow its owner. It doesn't, it knows who it's supposed to follow. That's what we're talking about. So you don't actually have to, have anything that connects you to the animal to engage in leading. And so, so there are some who say that the thing that doesn't make an acquisition, according to the Tanakama, is pulling a donkey. And there's some who say that some say it's leading a camel. So that's the conversation that we have. Okay, so the East Demosiv Misefa. Now there are some who say that this whole conversation, or you could have had this conversation with respect to the end of the Tanakama statement. Because if we take a look at the Tanakama statement, the first words on the page of Daf Tet Aleph are B'midazos Kanu, right? B'miduzu Kana. It's a different quotation, but that's what it's referring to. It's referring to those language. So B'midazu L'mu'utimai. What is it coming to say that it's specifically with respect to dragging, pulling or leading? How do I know that works? Lav l'mu'ute rachov. Isn't that coming to exclude the specific category of riding? No, l'mu'ute ibcha. No, it's coming to exclude the opposite. That it has to be, that only riding or leading will work, and not the other way around. If you're using it for the wrong animal. 1 second, ihachi hainu Rabbi Yehuda. Well, that ends up meaning that you're basically saying like Rabbi Yehuda, because remember, Rabbi Yehuda says specifically, you only acquire camels through pulling, and you only acquire donkeys through leading. You can't do both. So why, if B'midah Zot Kanu is telling us that you have to do the right method for the right animal, there's one specific side that doesn't work. So yes, for one of the animals, you can lead or pull, but for the other animal, you can only do one or the other, and both of them will not work. Ista Amre, or some people say that the one that doesn't work is pulling a donkey. And there are some who say that leading a camel is the one that doesn't work. Again, remember that it can't be both of them that don't work, because then that would be Rebbe Yehuda. Okay, so we've now explained that first brisa, and now we try a second time, another time, to show whether riding an animal acquires the animal. So let's take a look. So Tashma, another brisa, Echad Rachav Chamor, one's riding a donkey, Be'echad Tafas B'Moseira, and another person is holding the bridle of the donkey. Zeh Kana Chamor, the one who's riding it acquires the donkey. Zeh Kana Moseira, and the one who is holding the bridle acquires the bridle. Shma Mina Rachav Kani. Oh, that's a pretty good proof. Doesn't that show that riding constitutes an acquisition? No, we don't have to say that it's that riding always acquires. We could say that the riding that we're talking about here is where the person is leading the animal with their feet. So ihaki nikne nami rachov b'mosera. So the second, if he's acquiring the animal, let him acquire also the bridle that's on the animal. It should be part of that acquisition. So you're right. You know what? We'll change our conclusion. And let's say that what we mean when we say that the other one acquires the bridle, it's not that he acquires the whole bridle, but the first guy is going to acquire the donkey and half the bridle. And the second guy will acquire just half of the bridle. Well, Bishlam Arachav Kani, it makes sense that the person who's riding will acquire the bridle to kamagba le bendas, because somebody who has the capability to have intention to remember that we've already highlighted that that if two people pick something up at the same time, they effectively have to have in mind not only to acquire half of it for themselves, but they have to acquire half of it for the other person, because only then will the acquisition be valid, because the other half, it would be considered on the ground and you wouldn't have made a full lifting. So you need to have an in mind for the other person to have their half also, so that way the full acquisition works. So it makes sense when it comes to the perspective of the rider, for the rider's benefit, because the person who lifted the bridle had in mind to lift it in order for him to get half the bridle. But when the person who's holding the bridle, holding the reins, how is he going to acquire the other portion of the bridle that is being worn by the animal? Nobody ever lifted that. So all right, we'll qualify it again. And what we'll say is that actually what we mean is the first person who's riding the animal acquires the donkey and the entire bridle, and the one who is holding the bridle, holding the reins, he's going to get the just the piece that's in his hand. Hi, my, 1 second. That doesn't make any sense, because remember, how is it that this whole thing works? Is that the person who's holding the bridle has in mind that the other person should also acquire a piece of the bridle. But we're saying that the person who's lifting it up has in mind for the friend, and therefore the friend acquires. That's where he specifically lifts the thing in order for the person to get it. But here, the fact that he had in mind the other person, it was only in order to enable his own acquisition to work. He's not going to be successful on the half that he's hoping for. And now we're going to say that it ends up working entirely for the other guy? That can't be either. So Ravashi gives us the final first answer. And the first answer is Zekana Chamor Ubeis Page, Zekana Mashatavs Biyado. So the point is that the one who's riding acquires everything that's literally on the animal, and the one who's holding the bridle acquires everything in his hand. And the rest is not acquired by either of them, because the rider doesn't acquire it because there's no lifting of it and it's not connected to the animal, and the other person who's holding it doesn't acquire it because the other person is not having, because the other half of his bridle is effectively on the ground and he has never lifted it up, and so as a result he can only get what's in his hand. If part of the object that you're picking up is still on the ground, you have not made an acquisition on the entire object. You've only acquired what's in your hand. Rabbi Abahu offers a fourth possibility. So again, the third answer in this works. But now Rabbi Abahu says, you know what? La'olam kidakatani. Maybe we could say that we can hold exactly as we held originally, that the person who rides a donkey gets the donkey, the entire donkey, and the person who gets the bride, who's holding the bridle, gets the entire bridle. And how do we make that work? The issue is that since the person who is holding the bridle has the ability to just pull the entire thing, and we'll see in a moment, the key element is that the rest of the bridle is not on the ground. It's very easy to pull because it's already up. It's lifted up by the fact that it's on the animal, and it's not attached to the animal in a manner that can't just be pulled off. And so as a result, he could just pull it off and as a result and bring it to himself, and so he gets the entire thing. But Vahad Rabbi Abau Barusahi. But that opinion of Rabbi Abau is an outside opinion, because meaning that it's not accepted. Because if you don't say that, listen to what would be the implication. If you have a talus that's lying down, it's and imagine a traditional talus, because that's an easy example of something that's big, right? So you got part of it lying on the ground, and part of it is on a pillar. And let's say a person comes along and he picks up the half that's on the ground. Now, at that moment, when he's picked it up, do we say that it's all his? No, we don't, because the other half, even though it's on a pillar, is still considered on the ground. He hasn't picked up the whole thing. And now somebody else comes and lifts up the other half that's on the pillar. Are you going to tell me that only the first person acquires it and not the second person, because because he could have just pulled it to himself? We do not say that. So it must be that the view of Rabbi Abau is an outside view. And Rashi helps us out here a little bit to make clear what's going on. Why is it that we might think that it would work? So if you take a look at the Rashi, it's about 22, 23 lines up in the narrow lines of Rashi from the bottom of the page on Tet Amud Aleph. Because that pillar puts the talus on a high place, ha'ochza barosha, the person who's holding the other end of the talus, barosha hasheni, the second end, noach lo lintak u'haviyah etzlo. He can easily pull it to him, and it will go to him. Delo mechaser hagba, because all you need is the drawing of it. You don't need any lifting of it. So if one looks at it from a kinetic energy, I think that's the right term, perspective, so then you don't need to require, it doesn't require the same amount of energy. And so as a result, maybe the absence of that additional energy that's required will allow us to say that that this acquisition works. And we end up saying that no, Rabbi Abau can have that view, but it does not, in fact, is not consistent with what we believe the halacha to be. And so therefore it is an unaccepted position. So we
what was his view again? What was his view?
His view is that, remember, the Brisa said that if one person's riding a donkey and the other person's holding a bridle, the first acquires the donkey and the second acquires the bridle. Now, we ended up saying, according to Rav Ashi, that when we say that the first acquires the donkey, he actually acquires the part of the bridle that's on the donkey as well. And when we say that the other person acquires the bridle, all we're referring to is the amount of the bridle that's in his hand. That's how Rav Ashi understood it. But Rabbi Abau said, no, we could understand that Brisa the way it was originally written. The first one acquires the donkey and not the bridle, and the second acquires the bridle and it's the entire bridle. And why is it? It's because the person who's holding the bridle, even though he isn't holding the other end of the bridle, other end of the bridle is on the animal, which is effectively like it's on the ground because he's not actually lifting it, but because he could just pull it without actually having to do any lifting, and that would be, we're going to say that that's as if he has already made the acquisition completely. So, and then we quoted the Gemara that says, hey, if you were to say that, then a case of a talus on a pillar would also work. And clearly, we don't believe that a talus on a pillar would work as well. And so, as a result, we note that Rabbi Abau's position is rejected. Okay, but the thinking is, as Rashi just said, is that when you have something on a high up spot, So then, because you don't need to engage in any lifting, maybe the lifting of one end of the item is sufficient to make an acquisition. So now we're going to try again, trying for our third time today, another brisa in an effort to show that riding constitutes a method of acquisition. And this time we will actually be successful. Okay, so Tashma, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rachav Basadeh, Umanhig Be'ir Kana. That if you are riding an animal in the field or you are leading it in the city, well, then you have made an acquisition. And Rashi helps us out. 1, 2, 3, 5 lines up in Rashi. Rachav Basada, Behema Shel Metzia. We're talking about an animal that was found. Kona. You can acquire it through the riding in the field. Avalo Be'ir. But you cannot acquire it through riding in the city. B'taima mefarish l'kameh, and we're going to explain why not in a moment in the Gemara. Umanhig, but when it comes to leading, af be'ir kana. Not only does leading work in the field, but it will work even in a city. V'kol shekain b'sada, and it will certainly work in the field. Shma mina rachav l'chudei kani, and so as a result, doesn't this show that in fact riding alone constitutes an acquisition? So the Gemara answers, as we've answered every other time when we seem to have shown that riding works. Well, we can say that this is talking about somebody who's leading with his feet. Well, 1 second. Well, if that were true, then it's the same thing as leading. Meaning, what's the difference? So, Trey Gabne Manhig. No, there are two kinds of leading. One leading when you're on the animal, and one leading when you are off the animal. Well, Ihachi Rachav Be'ir my time alokani. Why, if you're riding in the city, why doesn't that make an acquisition? So Amarav Kahana Lafisha Ain Darkin Shel B'nei Adam Lirkov Be'ir. Maybe it's because people don't ride in the city. So there's no proof that riding doesn't make an acquisition. Riding does make an acquisition, even when you're leading. But the point is that it may be because people don't do it, so we're not going to say that. But Amrle Rav Ashi, the Rav Kahana, when Rav Ashi said to Rav Kahana, no, that doesn't work because Elamiata Hakbia Arnaki B'Shabbos. What if you were to lift a purse or a money container on Shabbos, which of course is muksa. People don't do that on Shabbos. So hachinami delokani. Are you going to tell me that the person didn't make an acquisition? Of course not. Of course that person would have made an acquisition. Elamai de avid v'kani. Whatever he did, and he'll make an acquisition. Acquisitions just work. You can't say that they don't work because of some custom in that particular location or that particular time. So hachinami ma'ida avid v'kani. So too, what he's done here, he's actually acquired it. So why doesn't it work? Meaning, so now we've shown that it can't be that we're talking about leading it in the street, leading it with your feet, but rather when we say that you can't lead it, we're talking about not a situation of riding, and we're not talking about the situation of a found animal. Rather, we're talking about a situation of a purchased animal. And to Amrle, Kani b'derech shebnei Adam konin. That, and the seller said, listen, you can make an acquisition in the way that people make an acquisition in this particular location. And so as a result, and as a result, the implication is that since this person did not do it in a conventional manner, because people don't ride animals in a city, it's too crowded. So as a result, we're going to say that it's not, at least that's the Hava meaning that we have at the moment, that it's too crowded. But we'll see in Rashi gives another explanation. So as a result, we'll say that in fact that does not. So we have no proof one way or the other. Even our third effort has turned out to not be successful, because it could be that we're not talking about a found animal, but we're talking about an acquisition. And it could be that the riding works because it's that we're talking about riding and leading with your feet. And so as a result, and the reason that it doesn't work in a city is because the person who's selling it specifically told the buyer that you have to acquire in the manner that people acquire things in the city, and that would not include riding. So now we actually come to the conclusion. The rishus harabim hu, but when it comes to the fact that a rider doesn't acquire in a city, we have a couple of exceptions. That even in the case of an acquisition, we would say that a rider acquires it if it's rishus harabim hu. That if in fact the location of the riding is the street, so then it will work. And why is that? And this is the Rashi that I was hinting to earlier. Be'ir rishus harabim hu kani be'ir derech lirko sham. That in the city, in the rishus harabim, you do ride the animal, the lola hanhig, and you don't just lead it. Pen yifsiku over drachim beino levein behemto, because we're worried. A person will be worried that somebody will come between him and his animal. If all he's doing is leading, then somebody will come between him and the animal, and he'll end up the animal will get lost and he will lose his animal. All right, so that's one category. The adam chashavu, so then cunning, right? The irishus harabimu cunning. The adam chashavu cunning. And similarly, if the person is sufficiently important, and let's go do the next little bit of the Gemara as well. The ijahi kanya. And similarly, with a woman, she'll make an acquisition. So let's take a look at the second Rashi on Tedem and Bet. The adam chashavu ain darko lahanig behema biraglav. Then it's not customary for such a person to lead the animal with his feet. The derech kavod lirkov aleha. It's more he's going to, because of his status, he is going to ride the animal, and therefore af bismat samta, even in a simta, even in an alley, she'ein b'nei adam sham, even when there's no other people there, we're going to say that it's appropriate for an important person to ride the animal. V'chein isha, and similarly with a woman, she'ein ba koach la'achos ha'behema pen tinate kemena. And with respect to a woman, she's going to ride it because she may not have the strength to keep the animal going in the way she wants it to go if it goes in a different direction, if it wants to go in a different direction. So as a result, we're going to say that it's okay for her to ride it. And then one more, the inish zilahu kani. And if the person is a very base person, if a person is a very, not a low life is how I defined it. If that person is not doesn't care about what other people think about him, so then riding will also work. And Rashi explains, first of the narrow lines of Rashi on Tanam Bet, Shadarko Lirkov Lifnei Kol. His custom is to ride in front of anybody. He has no embarrassment about the fact that he's, spreading his legs across an animal. Af below dochik, even when there's no need for him to do so. Because he has no sense of modesty. About Adam Bainani, a regular person, who's not so important, but Osher with his wealth. The Ainu Bosh, and therefore Laholok Behema Biraglav. And so as a result, he will not be embarrassed to help lead the animal with his feet. Ain Darko Lirko Besimta Beir Mishum Tzniut. He's not going to take an acquisition in an alleyway because he wants to be modest and does not want to, again, we're not necessarily talking about horses here, which are more narrow body, but wider body animals. He doesn't want to sort of go and ride on the animal because that would not be, as Rashi explains, particularly modest. Okay, so now we've come to the conclusion, and it seems like we're going to say again, depending on how one understands this last piece of the Gemara, it seems like they understand the Gemara to say that actually riding does work, and it's just plain riding, even without using your feet. But when it comes to and so as a result, we have concluded that riding can make an acquisition, and so as a result, when you go back to our Mishnah, even though our Mishnah could have been about a situation where somebody was riding and leading with their feet, we can say that no, it's just a case of regular riding, and that's making an acquisition. Okay. So by Rebbe Lazar.
But he says, but Rashi concludes that it's the average person would not ride it. That these are special
in a city, and in an alleyway in a city. So in other places, right? Remember that we said the first words on Tedem Bet are the Irishus Harabim who cunning. If it's on a public thoroughfare, meaning again where a person might be worried that somebody would come between, well then riding will be sufficient. And so that's the key element. And the bottom line is that we understand the adam chashav, or if the person's sufficiently important. So the only situation that doesn't work is the one that Rashi notes at the end, which is a simta, some sort of alleyway, meaning a part of the city that is not a public thoroughfare, and we're talking about an average person who doesn't want to. Again, remember that we don't have pants yet, and so as a result, without pants, you don't want to spread your legs over an animal because it might not be the most modest thing to do. However, if you are a sufficiently honored person, well then you're riding because of honor, and so as a result you can make an acquisition. So again, it's only the average person in a non-public thoroughfare where we would say that the person's not going to want to make an acquisition by riding the animal.
But one could interpret that these are all these exclusions, that this case, in this case, riding works. But in general, riding would not work.
Well, all of these exclusions are only in connection with riding in a city. Because again, remember, Eliezer said one who rides an animal in the fields does work. And so as a result, we say, and it can't be talking about riding while leading, because if it's riding while leading, so then why should it be any different between a city and a field? And we end up saying that, the reason that it's different is because the Stellar specifically qualified it and said that you have to acquire it in the manner that people acquire things. You can't use a non-customary approach to acquiring. And so as a result, an average person in the city, not in a public thoroughfare, will won't make an acquisition through riding. But if in fact the animal had been found, well, then you would be able to ride it. You'd be able to ride it anywhere, because once we say, that was the question that Rav Ashi asked. Rav Ashi said, I don't understand. Once we say that a certain kind of acquisition works, it's going to work, period. So that's the situation. Okay, so the point is that riding works in general, and it's only in the city and only by an average person and only not on a public thoroughfare that it doesn't work. And that's exactly the way Rashi ends, right? Rashi ends with Aval Adam Beinani, right? 1, 2, 3rd line at the end of the line of narrow lines of Rashi. Aval Adam Beinani, Kagon She'enu Chashav Ba'osher, the person who's an average guy who doesn't have any importance because of his wealth. Ve'enu Bosh Laholach Bahema B'Raglav, and so as a result, he's not going to be embarrassed to walk with the animal. Ein Darko Lirko Besimta. He's not, that person is the one who's not going to ride the animal in an alleyway, Be'ir, in a city, Mishum Tzniut, because of Tzniut. And so as a result, only when the seller makes that condition of having you acquire it in the normal manner, we're going to say that therefore won't make an acquisition. But in an ordinary situation of a found item, then it would work. So that's the way the Gemara seems to be going, that if you found the item, then we say that once we say an acquisition works, it's going to work everywhere. Okay, so now the Gemara wonders whether acquiring an animal can be used to acquire vessels that are on the animal. And actually, I probably should adjust it. It's not actually acquiring the animal. The question is whether you can use the method of acquiring an animal to acquire the vessels and not the animal. That's the question. So, by Rabbi Lazar, Omer lechavera. If somebody says to his friend, Mishok behemazo liknos kalim sha'aleha, drag this animal, pull this animal to you in order to acquire the vessels that are on it. Mahu. What's the law? I'm not trying to give you my animal. I'm only trying to give you the vessels that are on it, and I'm trying to make it easy for you, right? Imagine, I've got bundles of vessels, and you're buying all of them. It would be a big pain. You can't lift it all at once, so you'd have to, open the container and lift them part one by one in order to be successful in making the acquisitions. This would be so much easier. So does this work? So liknos, 1 second. You can't have meant in order to acquire, because liknos, mi amar like kne, did the person ever tell him to acquire? And Rashi explains, if we take a look at liknos, mi amar like kne, 1, 2, 3, 6, not 10 lines down in the narrow lines of Rashi on Teremabed, liknos mashma, that liknos implies atahis kaven liknos. You have an intention to acquire, ani ain't a but I am not actually conveying to you anything. But that doesn't work. If you intend to acquire something of mine and I do not intend to give it to you, it still belongs to me. So Ella Mishok Behemazu Ukne Kalim Sha'aleha Mahu. So really what Rabbi Lazar is asking is, listen, pull the animal towards you, and through that acquire the utensils on it. So what's the law? Do we say that drawing an animal near, pulling an animal creates an acquisition of the vessels? Olo, or do we not? So Amar Rava,
sort of like renting or borrowing a car to transport your furniture.
Yeah, well, to not to transport, but remember here
to acquire the furniture.
That's exactly right, 100%. That would be a wonderful analogy. So Amar Rava, Amar le kine behema ukne kalim mim kane kalim. Well, 1 second. You're almost assuming that if I actually conveyed to you the animal along with the vessels, that would work, because effectively, if I transfer you an animal and I say, and you get everything that's on the animal, and it doesn't work, well, then of course, if I were to just try to convey you the vessels themselves without the animal, your pulling of the animal won't work. And so Rava is asking, why does it work when you try to acquire both the animal and the vessels? It constitutes a moving courtyard. And we have a general rule that anything that moves cannot create a space, a courtyard for an acquisition. And if you want to tell me, oh, well, we'll just say it's standing still. If while it's moving, it doesn't make an acquisition, it also can't make an acquisition when it's standing still. So we have to say that what he was talking about is where the animal is bound, meaning there's no possibility for the animal to move. Its legs are tied up. And the question is if I draw the animal to me, is it like a basket? If I draw a basket, if for example, you were to have all of the boxes that I'm acquiring on a dolly, and I now pull the dolly to me, so then I have made the acquisition, because I have sufficiently lifted the items. At least I believe that would be the case, and therefore, I own it. So the question is, so as a result, when will the animal be treated like that dolly? It'll be treated like that dolly if, in fact, the animal is bound up, so it doesn't have the ability to move on its own. So Amrulay, and we actually never answer Rebbe Lazar's question. But now that we've mentioned one form of moving courtyard, the Gemara is going to discuss two other situations. So Amrulay, Rav Papa, Rav Huna, Braid, Rav Yoshua, La Rabba. Well, 1 second, the Rav Papa says, Ella and Rav Huna say, Ella Mi'ata, if based on what you're saying, that a moving courtyard doesn't work. Hayam Mahalik Basfina, if you're traveling in a boat, the Katsu dug him, Benavlu Tochasfina, and fish jump out and go into the boat. Are you going to tell me that the boat doesn't make an acquisition for you and somebody else can just come along and take those fish and say that they're theirs? Of course not. That can't possibly be. So Amr Lahu, Rabba explains to them, no, it actually, and this is okay. So he says to them, Svina menach naicha umayahu dekamamtu la. That actually what's going on is that the boat doesn't, they didn't have a powered transportation. And so the boat itself, that's not considered a moving courtyard. The boat is really at rest. It's not moving at all. Umayahu dekamamtu la. It's the water that moves it. So as a result, it is not considered a traveling courtyard, and so as a result, it does not. The owner would acquire the fish. So Amrle Ravina Ravashi. So Ravina had a similar exchange with Ravashi. Elamiata Haisama Lekas Bershos Rabim. If a woman's traveling in public, the Zarak law get, and the husband throws her a divorce, Latoch Cheka or Latoch Kalata, into her lap or her basket. Hakanami Galoma Garsha. Are you going to tell me that she's not divorced because she herself would be like a traveling courtyard? So Amrle, Kalta Minach Naicha Vi'i de Kamasagya Mutusa. No, in fact, her basket is resting and she's the one who's walking. So it seems like it might not work to put it in her hand, but it would work to if she's walking, but it does work to put it in the basket, because the basket is not considered a movable courtyard. The basket is standing still, and she's the one who's moving underneath it. And so we've got now the principle that says, basically, is the item itself movable on its own, or is some other force doing the moving of it? If some other force is doing the moving, then it can be then even if the object is moving, it can actually make an acquisition. And if it's itself it's moving, well, then it's going to be a movable courtyard, and a movable courtyard cannot make an acquisition.
I don't get the.
Go ahead. Are you on mute? I don't hear you. Oh no, I lost you. Okay. When you come back, we'll get your question. So Haya Rochev al Gabi Behema, Vira as Hametzia. So now we're continuing on with the theme of finding things. And so the Mishnah says, listen, somebody's riding an animal and he sees a $10 bill on the ground. And he says to somebody else, he says to his friend, Tanali, could you give that to me? Natala, the person took it, having in mind initially, we're going to say, to give it to the owner, to the person who's riding the animal. And then he says, you know what? And before he gives it to the guy, he says, I'm taking it for myself. You may have found it, but I'm the one who picked it up. Zachaba, the person who picked it up, he gets it. However, if the person who picked it up gives it to the rider, and then Amar Ani Zachisi Batchila, 1 second, I actually had in mind that I wanted to acquire it. Lo Amar Klum, he hasn't said anything. The rider gets to keep it. Okay, so now we're going to ask a question on this from a Mishnah in Peah. So the Mishnah, this question is going to take a little bit of a time to get through, but you'll see the question, and that's how we will conclude for today. Tanan Hasam, we've got a Mishnah in Peah. Misha Likat as Peah. If you got somebody who's gathering Peah, and we have not yet specified whether that person is entitled to Peah or he's collecting for somebody else, and he's not entitled to Peah. But let's assume that if somebody has picked up some paya v'amar, and he says, "Hare zula ploni," I am picking it up for ploni ani, for this particular poor person. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Zachalo. Rabbi Eliezer says that the poor person who he specified has acquired the item. No, the first person that he had in mind does not necessarily acquire the item, and he needs to give it to the first poor person available to him. So Amar Ula, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Machlokas mi Ashir la'ani. The dispute is about when the person who's lifting the item, who's collecting the paya, is wealthy, and he's not eligible for the paya, and he's doing it on behalf of a person who's poor. The Rabbi Eliezer Savar Migo de Iboy Mafkir Nichse, that Rabbi Eliezer says, listen, since the guy, if he wants to, he can give up all of his possessions, Vahavi Ani v'chazile, and therefore he'll be poor and he'll be eligible to have paya. So we'll treat him as if he's now eligible. Umigu de zachi lenafshe, and since he could pick it up for himself, zachi nami lechabre, he also has the ability to pick it up for somebody else. The Rabbanan Sabre, and the rabbis say no. God migo amrinan will say since once, meaning we'll say since only in connection with since he can acquire it for himself, he can acquire it for the other person, but we won't say Tremi go low amrinan. We're not going to go so far as to say that since he could also get rid of all of his stuff, he's eligible for paya.
I have a question about the language here. It says me shalike et hapea. Are they talking about paya or leket?
No, paya. They're talking about paya. It's
That's
leket.
strange.
The term leket. It's a little confusing because leket is
it's something else.
Is things that have been fall. They fell
to the ground. Yeah,
exactly. So the reason that it's called leket is because you were in the process of gathering it and then it dropped, and so as a result, as long as not too much drops, you're not allowed to pick it up, and you let other people gather. But the term leket just means to gather, and so that's the language. So, but we're talking about paya here, and it's actually again from the Mishnayos in paya. Right. But when the machlokas is in that Mishnah in paya is when a wealthy person picks up the paya for a poor person. That's where Rabbi Eliezer says it works, and the Chachamim say no, it does not. But when a poor person when one poor person picks it up and has in mind to pick up for another person, everybody agrees that it works. Since it works for himself, it would work for somebody else. So Amrle Rav Nachman le'ula, one second ula, how can you say that? You should actually say that the machlokas in that Mishnah is when it's a poor person, because the Metzia hakol aniyah metzla. Because take a look at our case in our Mishnah. Everybody's poor when it comes to the found item, because neither, nobody, everybody has a right to it. Utanan, and yet we learned we said that if the person's riding and he asks another person to pick it up, and then the person picks it up and we are going to assume has in mind for the person who's riding, and yet then he says, I'm going to keep it for myself, he gets to keep it for himself. It must be that when he picked it up, having in mind the rider, that was not an acquisition. And amra bishlama, if you say like me, it all works, because me ani machlokas, the argument in the Mishnah in Peah is with respect to a poor person for another poor person, and so as a result, I can say, as we turn to Yudam and Aleph, Masnisin Mani Rabbanani. Who's the Mishnah like? It's the rabbis. The rabbis say that when you pick up the item, when the poor person in that Mishnah in Peah, when the person picks up the item, he does not successfully pick it up for the person he has in mind. And so similarly here in our Mishnah, when the person picks up the $10 bill that he found, that the rider found and asked him to pick up, the rider does not acquire it. But if you say, as you are saying, Rabbi Eliezer, that the argument is in connection I'm sorry, if you say, as you're saying, Ula, that the argument is with respect to a rich person who picks up for a poor person, but when it comes to a poor person picking it up for another poor person, everybody will agree that the other poor person will have the acquisition. Money. Who is our Mishnah like? Lo Rabbanan. It's not the rabbis, but Lo Rabbi Eliezer, because everybody says that, according to you, Ula, everybody says that in the situation of one poor person for another poor person, the picking up for the other poor person works. So why doesn't, in our Mishnah, the picking up of the $10 bill by the person who I asked to pick it up for while I'm riding my animal, why isn't his picking up sufficient for me to acquire the item? And on that note, for the answer to that question, you're going to need to stay tuned for tomorrow's daf. Have a wonderful.
But he was directed by the person writing. He said, "I see that object. Pick it up for me."
You know what? I sort of ran out of time yesterday, so I didn't actually even have a chance to go over the answer myself. Well, it could very well be that's part of the answer. So, but we'll see. We'll see that, God willing, tomorrow. Looking forward to continuing our learning together.
So I have a question on the previous sugya that I was asking, and I got kicked off. Boats in Talmudic times were powered either by wind or by oars. So they all moved as a result of a force that was not the boat. They didn't.
Oh no! You got cut off again. Oh, that's so frustrating. All right. I'm sorry that we didn't get that question. Everybody have a great Shabbos. I will send a note to Charlie separately that he should feel free to ask it in the WhatsApp group. So looking forward to continuing our learning maybe there. All right. Have a great day, everybody. Have a good Shabbos.